In this course, we'll interact with the operating system a lot. So before we deep dive into more complex concepts, let's do a quick rundown of what we mean when we talk about the operating system, or OS for short. The operating system is the software that manages everything that goes on in the computer. It reads, writes, and deletes files from the hard drive. It handles how the processes start, how they interact with each other, and how they eventually finish. It manages how memory gets allocated to different processes, how network packets are sent and received, and how each program can access the different hardware components. Basically, the OS is a total boss and doesn't mess around. There are actually two main parts to an operating system, the kernel and the user space. The kernel is the main core of an operating system. It talks directly to our hardware and manages our system's resources. As users, we don't interact with the kernel directly. Instead, we interact with the other part of the operating system called the user space. The user space is basically everything outside of the kernel. These are things that we interact with directly, like the system programs and user interface. So when we say operating system, we're referring to both the kernel and the user space. The operating system does a lot of things. It does so much that we need a bunch of courses to cover all of it. But for this course, we'll focus on managing files and processes on the OS running on your computer. The scripts we'll write will all run in the user space. In some cases, though, our scripts may interact with the kernel of the operating system to get extra information or to ask it to perform certain operations. As you probably already know, there's a lot of different operating systems out there. The major operating systems used in IT today are Windows, macOS, and Linux. The Windows operating system is developed by Microsoft and is widely used in the business and consumer space. Most PCs come with Windows as the default operating system. macOS is developed by Apple and is mainly used in the consumer space. If you purchase any Apple computer, it'll come with macOS preloaded. Linux is an open source operating system. Open source software is free to share, modify, and distribute. Score. Linux is used heavily in business infrastructure. Most servers in the world today are running Linux. It's also available in the consumer space, although less common. Linux itself is actually the name of the kernel originally developed by Linus Torvalds, also a total boss. Because of the evolution of the rest of the operating system, we typically use Linux to refer to both the kernel and the whole operating system. Today, Linux has grown into a huge community effort, with developers all over the world contributing to its success. Because Linux is open source, a lot of different organizations package their own versions of it, unlike Windows or macOS, which are solely developed by their respective companies. We refer to these different flavors of Linux as distributions. Some common Linux distributions are Ubuntu, Debian, and Red Hat. If you've heard of Chrome OS, you may know that it's another operating system based on the Linux kernel. But unlike other distributions, Chrome OS is usually considered an OS in its own right. Lastly, the Android operating system, which is used a lot on smartphones, also runs a Linux kernel. You may have also heard of Unix. Unix is an operating system developed back in the 70s by Bell Labs. After its original release, the OS went through a bunch of different versions with different companies releasing variants of it. The fundamental ideas of how Linux works today are based on the Unix principles. And a lot of the tools that we use to interact with the operating system are open source versions of those originally developed for Unix. This is why these tools and operating principles are usually referred to as Unix, even though the OS we're using is called Linux. So Linus created Linux, which is based on Unix. It's basically a programming tongue twister. Try saying it 10 times fast. The macOS kernel and some of its user space are also based on a kernel and user space tools from the Unix family, known as BSD. So although the graphical interface is extremely different between the two, the command line is actually pretty similar. Like we said earlier, in this course, we'll use Python to interact with the operating system. Python is a cross-platform language. You can use it on Windows, macOS, Linux, and even lesser-known Unix variants like FreeBSD. It's even available on mobile phones. Since it's cross-platform, we can use the same Python code to get to our goal on any operating system, whether the goal is opening files, processing text, or managing running processes. This makes Python a great tool for IT specialists who need to interact with different operating systems. You can apply the skills that you learn from one platform to all the others. So how helpful is that? As we called out before, for the exercises in this course, we'll be practicing with Linux computers. We've chosen Linux because it's the industry standard when it comes to servers that are managed remotely and through automation. When it's relevant, we'll also talk about how the same concepts will apply to Windows or Mac OS. In my job as a sysadmin, I mainly work with the Linux operating system. I grew up using Windows computers and interacted with them through the graphical interface. The very first time I used Linux was when I was a teenager and my PC crashed. It wouldn't boot up into the user environment. I had a lot of different files and docs I didn't want to give up. So I did some research, and on a friend's computer, I burned a portable Linux OS called Slacks onto a CD. I got my PC to boot up from there and was able to rescue most of my files. Learning Linux opened up a whole new world of customization and configuration for me. When I first started, I found it really interesting, intriguing, and even a little bit scary. Today, Linux is the primary OS I use to work every day. We've learned a bunch of things about operating systems and their histories. If all those different names are making you feel like your human operating system is crashing, don't worry. You'll pick it up as we go along. Now that we know we're on the same page when we say OS, in the next video, we're going to get our computer ready to work with Python.